are you a gentle parent?
What do y'all think?
So some of you sent me this reel and asked for my thoughts, and I will give them. But first, I just want to say, what a week, right? Like, first we had Doug Wilson making headlines with his CNN interview, and then all the conversation surrounding the death of Dr. James Dobson. I mean, so many touch points for the work Kelsey and I have been doing over the past 2 years, and such a long overdue conversation. And then here it is in all the headlines in real time, people processing. So thoughts going in many different directions. This conversation, is gentle parenting biblical, is gentle parenting Christian, etc., crops up perennially in Christian parenting spaces. And I do have some observations to make about it, but I'm going to do them over on YouTube in a longer form conversational style. So you don't want to hear the whole YouTube conversation I want to make is I don't think this clip is really about gentle parenting methodology. I think this clip is about reassuring insiders about a correct and very specific theological framework. And I think you see this because gentle parenting is not defined, as is typically the case in this. And at the end, the concern is primarily theological about a child's cognitive understanding of sin, salvation, and atonement. So here I want to say first, go check out Megan Hampton's Soul Care for Families page. She did 2 stitches of this today. Excellent, well worth your time. In one, she invites Christian parents to consider a more holistic theology of redemption that factors in Genesis 1 and 2, doesn't just land on Genesis 3. And also another reel inviting parents to consider child development, both in how we have this conversation about sin and the story of salvation, as well as how we talk about a child's behavior or misbehavior as sin. They're really, really thoughtful, and I'll put them in the stitches highlight behind this. We went Friday night in my little office talking about theology. I'll see you over. Welcome to the conversation. First observation I want to make is that this is not a new conversation. It repeats all the time in Christian parenting circles. It's not a new conversation for Allie Beth or for Abby. They've had it before on the Relatable podcast. Abby's had it on a number of other podcasts. It's not a new conversation for the people in the audience. That is why there's a punchline. That's why it's funny. They already know what Abby's going to say if she's a gentle parent, right? And I make that observation because I think, at least in the context of the conference, this is really functioning as an insider-insider conversation to reassure the people there who are all on the same page that they are doing Christian parenting right. And this takes a number of different forms. It's not unique to gentle parenting. It's not unique to the people, to Abby and Allie Beth either, right? You can fill in the blanks with other people and other topics, and it happens because I think it's born of this fundamental starting place that understandably devout, sincere Christian parents have, especially if they have a high respect for scripture, that there is a biblical parenting methodology. And if they can just figure that out, they can get parenting right. And that can be really reassuring to think that. And one way you can be reassured that you are getting it right is by identifying what's outside the bounds and what other people are doing. And I am not doing that. I am doing it right. They are doing it wrong. That can be reassuring. And it's very understandable, right? Like parenting is overwhelming. The stakes are really high, especially when you're talking about theological frameworks, and we want to get this right. So it's understandable. Unfortunately, it often short circuits critical thinking and robs Christian parents of the freedom that could be theirs. What do I mean by short circuits critical thinking? I mean, particularly when you have influencer culture coming into this, and Abby is an influencer and Allie Beth is an influencer to a certain degree. So I think it's fair to identify that. You have people who are platforming themselves to speak on a number of different topics. And often their lifestyle is part of their aesthetic. So their choices that they have made become exemplary for people in a number of ways that are directly and indirectly communicated. So they may have exercised critical thinking to get to their chosen endpoint. But when that is then said from a position of an influencer platform, their experience, their take becomes normative for everyone else. And I think too, with influencers, it gets really muddy, right? Because you may follow someone because you like their home design or because you like their travel journal or because you like their political take or whatever. And it so happens that you end up hearing their parenting takes. And this also reinforces that insider-insider dynamic because of parasocial kind of virtual relationships. You feel like you're connected with them, like you belong, like you're part of the same group. Um, so I think sometimes that's going on in these kind of conversations at levels that I don't know if people are specifically parsing that out. And this happens with all kinds of Christian parenting experts. It's how Christian parenting empires are built. And it's a challenging piece of how you assign accountability or not as well, because oftentimes, even people who are literally writing Christian parenting books and selling them will also try and say, well, this is just something we did for our family. And it gets very muddy because on the receiving end of that, it's coming with a position of platform and presence that is communicating something else. So, anyway, hijacks critical thinking. And also, I think robs Christian families of the freedom that could be theirs. What I mean by that is the Bible has very little to say about parenting methodology, particularly like contemporary parenting methodology. For Christian parents, there's only one direct instruction given. Fathers, do not embitter or provoke your children to anger. In Ephesians 6, it's followed up with, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Beyond that, we have all these relational principles that apply to all Christian relationships that we can apply to the parent-child relationship. All the one anothering verses. Restore the one who sins gently. Be kind, be patient, be forbearing with one another. All the fruit of the Spirit. Jesus' direct instruction to love your neighbor as yourself, including your smallest and newest neighbors, right? These are general principles that we can apply, but they're not specific parenting methodologies. You're not going to find out, should you co-sleep under there? Should you use a naughty stool under there? You're not going to find out these kind of very modern ideas about child rearing. So that's the first piece. And then the flip of that is often in these conversations about, is gentle parenting biblical or not? Gentle parenting is not clearly defined. And gentle parenting is just a big category. Typically, it's defined by people opting in, someone saying, I'm a gentle parent or I'm not a gentle parent, as we see here. And it's whatever they mean by that. And maybe the person in the audience also has something in mind. But if it's not clearly defined, you don't really know. You don't really have a way to say, well, does this align with the general principles we do see for relationship? Does this align with the life and teaching of Jesus? If you don't have specifics, you can't really weigh in. It becomes very muddy. So for those listening who want to have this conversation, I think it's rarely productive unless the terms are defined. What does someone mean by gentle parenting? What do they not mean? Because if you will go look in the comments, I bet even on this original post, you will find people who do identify as gentle parents desperately shouting into the void that gentle parenting does not equal permissive parenting. And this is a straw man that shows up again and again. Typically when Christians are saying, I reject gentle parenting, they are meaning, I am worried about more permissive forms of parenting. Or I have a friend who says they follow gentle parenting and I don't like the way her kids are behaved. Or I see young adults these days failing to launch, and it must be because of their parents' poor parenting choices. It must be gentle parenting. So often there are just a lot of sweeping assumptions made, and we all do this to each other. Again, it's not unique to critics of gentle parenting. I think a lot of it is we want the reassurance that we're doing it right. Because if there's a different methodology out there that we haven't adopted, that could say something about our own. Maybe it's a critique of our own. Maybe we should think through something else. So sweeping statements aren't substantiable typically. Like, for instance, a lot of people will say the problem with young adults these days is gentle parenting. Well, gentle parenting as a term, whatever someone means by it, doesn't really show up till 2011, 2012. So it's relatively recent. If you want to talk about gentle parenting, it's still very much a question mark. It's still very much an experimental thing. In general, though, like parenting trends do swing back and forth, and they're reactionary. They will swing in a more permissive, child centric direction, and then they will swing back in a more authoritarian, parent centric direction. And yeah, I mean, this is Dobson reacting to Dr. Spock. This is attachment parenting reacting to Dobson. This is Gary Ezzo reacting to attachment parenting. This is probably whatever would become gentle parenting reacting to things like Baby Wise and Gary Ezzo. And this is FAFO parenting reacting to whatever people mean by gentle parenting, right? The pendulum kind of does does swing, even for these sort of poorly defined ideas. But typically, it's this tug of war between people saying kids need more authority and discipline, parents need to step up more, even if parents aren't necessarily slacking, right? Like Dobson was saying this, but it's not like parents in the 70s weren't spanking their kids. Like across the board, most American parents were. Many kids were still being spanked in public schools. What really is going on is this commentary on, I'm worried about what I see in society, so it must be the parents' fault and we need more discipline. So some similar things happen back and forth. Like, and again, you can't quite quantify. How do you know if someone's gentle parenting? What do you mean by gentle parenting, et cetera, et cetera? So the pendulum swings. People are worried. They want reassurance they're doing it right. They do like to blame parents for doing it wrong. We see little snippets of other people's parenting or things going awry, and it's easy to say, well, they're just doing it wrong. And sometimes that can make us feel better about the choices we made. Abby does encourage people to critically examine the worldview of any method. And I am all on board with that, right? Like we wrote a whole book critically examining Christian parenting teaching. I think that's great advice. Like look at the underlying theological assumptions, look at the surrounding history, look at the sociological implications. That is part of the work of critical thinking. And I'm not here to advocate for or against gentle parenting so much as to return agency to parents to explore that if they want. If they resonate with that methodology, explore it. Do that work of figuring out what you think it means and comparing it to the general principles, the tremendous freedom you do have in there. The only kind of concrete thing we get in this clip is a reference to Dr. Becky Kennedy's book, Good Inside, which I don't think Becky Kennedy identifies as a gentle parent. She calls her parenting sturdy parenting that has strong boundaries and like connected parents. So again, I'm not exactly sure what they mean by gentle parenting. I think, again, it's an expression of like, I think people are getting too soft out there. They're getting too permissive, and that's a problem. Um, I think there's just a general knee jerk reaction sometimes to that. But what is really being targeted here is Becky Kennedy's book, Good Inside. And that takes us to what I think this conversation, at least in this reel, in this broader context, is about sin, atonement, and message anthropology of children being key ingredients to someone's salvation. So that kind of takes the conversation in a different direction. And I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what the takeaway for someone sitting in the audience is like. I'm sort of envisioning a mom with young children, maybe toddlers or preschoolers, who is trying to figure out methods, maybe is dealing with tantrums, maybe is dealing with a frustrating situation, and has a vision that there's going to be a biblical way to do this. And so looks to someone like Abby, who has a number of children, looks to an older parent, looks to people who they respect for other reasons. Like maybe they resonate with their denominational affiliation, their political affiliation, their region of the country, their decorating aesthetic, whatever. And then they think, oh, well, I can find a good solution to the challenges I'm having in parenting by following this person's advice, which totally makes sense. Um, I would like to suggest that this is deeply problematic when we do this at the distance with which we do it. After reading so many Christian resources that essentially were prototype influencers before social media was around, um, you can have that feeling of personal trust with someone through the pages of a book or through a screen in particular, or certainly through skilled influencer content that doesn't give you the information you need to determine if this is someone you would like to take parenting advice from in ordinary life. You just don't have that kind of data set. The end of our book, we do include like a tool to invite you to kind of like ask yourself different questions in different categories. And one of them is like, what how do I know this person? Like what is my context for connecting with them? Like, do I have a way to see in real life the fruit of their teaching in some way? So I think we're kind of at a disadvantage when our primary way of taking parenting advice is coming through the lens of influencer culture and then at a distance. Because I think then the takeaway for that maybe parent who's looking for help is this soundbite that says, well, gentle parenting's not an option for me because my child's eternity is at stake, rather than a, gosh, you are free to check out a whole number of methodologies as far as parenting methods. And certainly those might shift over seasons and ages of your children. And in some ways, it's kind of neither here nor there. Like, are you loving your child as yourself? Are you following the pattern of Jesus, who humbled himself and became a servant? Are you demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit? Like these sort of general relational applications. Um, Outside of that, you can kind of like try it out. What fits your personality? What fits the temperament of your children? But again, I'm kind of rabbit trailing. It's again Friday night. I'm becoming a little less coherent. So I'll try and wrap this up. I think the real heart of concern here comes at the end. It's about a concern that we are telling children they're too good. We're not telling them enough about sin. And we are missing an opportunity to present the gospel, which is summarized as, she says substitutionary atonement, but I'm interpreting this as penal substitutionary atonement is what she means. And so a couple of observations here, right? Like, I'm not here to tell you what theory of atonement you should take. I do want to say there are multiple theories of atonement. And I want to say that again and again, because I've heard from so many people over the past 2 years who, until they started, following along to hear about Christian parenting teaching, had never heard that there are multiple theories of atonement. And this is not a controversial thing to state. This is a historical reality. You can trace them. There's the moral example theory. There's ransom theory. There's Christus Victor. There's satisfaction theory. There's penal substitutionary atonement. It's a relatively recent theory. It's a relatively controversial theory. If you are in certain corners of the American evangelical church, you will not think of it as a controversial theory because it may be the only one you have been told. But historically speaking, globally speaking, yes, it is a relatively new one. In fact, I just recorded a great conversation. It's a bonus episode of In the Church Library this afternoon with Andrew Rilera, author of Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understanding of Jesus' Death. Outstanding book. I think you'll love the conversation if you're interested in this. He is a scholar of the book of Leviticus, really goes deep, even if you just like a Bible study nerd like me and you want to just learn more about the atoning sacrifices in Leviticus and their significance. It's a great conversation, but one of the questions raised by it is, have we correctly understood in a historical, critical, and grammatical level what was going on conceptually in the sacrifices in Leviticus? Or are we reading back onto them something we have created from our own theological understanding? And it's an important question that has very real application. So anyway, my point there is that there are multiple atonement theories. You will find theologians kind of talking about children and sin in squishy ways, in different ways. Some will say, look, children are Edenic, kind of like Adam and Eve when they're born as babies. Others will say they are born depraved sinners, total depravity. You will say some who kind of talk about age of accountability at a certain level, in differing ways. Because, okay, so and we do have a chapter on sin in our book. So if you're interested in this, you should pre-order because we do get into all the details of this. The short version here is that original sin, the concept of original sin, you can think of as taint or disease, might be more helpful than thinking of sin. Because I think for many evangelicals, we muddy together the idea of original sin with like willful disobedience. But original sin you can think of as taint or disease. And historically speaking, the church believed this is dealt with baptism, with washing and regeneration of baptism. And this is why the majority historical position has been infant baptism. So get those babies baptized, original sin dealt with. Then the idea was when children reach age of accountability, when they are morally, developmentally, by our terms, developmentally able to understand their moral culpability. And this is child driven, right? This is not a parent saying, I think my child's tantrum is rebellion. This is a child who is saying, I lied and I believe that was wrong. Do you see the distinction? I think that's really important because sometimes Christian parenting teachers will give lip service to age of accountability. And what they really mean is a parent is assigning sin motivations, often to very young children. But historically speaking, the age of accountability is a child knowing their right hand from their left. And it's why there was such a rush to baptize, right? Like, I think this is lore, but I like to think it's true. There's a story of like Martin Luther grabbing his baby from the childbirth bed and running out at midnight to baptize the baby because the sense was like, this is so urgent. And you still see this like in Luther's theology, right? Like he struggled with a lot of scrupulosity and concerns about committing being damned and committing sins that couldn't be pardoned. And when he broke free of that, he would remember his baptism. He would mark his baptism because that became something outside his mental gymnastics to look at and say, that is the moment of my deliverance. And it was also important in his context that this wasn't dependent on the holiness of the priest, right? Because he lived in a time when the clergy were corrupt. There were all sorts of problems. So it was the act of baptism that you could kind of hook your hope to. So you can kind of see this, some theological distinctives show up in this view toward children. Okay, that is a really long-winded way of getting at this particular view that Abby's talking about of it's very important that your child understand they're a sinner in order to understand salvation so they can accept the gospel is I don't know if I want to say exclusively, but is going to be predominantly Baptist, Anabaptist, maybe some non denominational. But these are people who probably don't, I'm guessing, I don't know Abby's theological position. I'm guessing she doesn't hold to infant baptism. I'm guessing it's believers' baptism. And thus, there really is an eternal stakes, strong pressure on parents early on to communicate um, sufficient understanding of sin, atonement, and the profession of faith that a child would pray the sinner's prayer, right? Because it's not baptism done to you, it is you professing something in order to receive baptism. That distinction becomes really important. So, again, I'm not here to tell you what to believe or to oversimplify, but to say these things are relevant to the conversation that's being had. That's not really about gentle parenting. It's about a very specific theological framework that is not held by many people in still well within the bounds of Orthodox Christian faith. Now, I don't know. Maybe someone who held to this would say, well, look, I think if you don't hold to it, you're not a real Christian. I don't know. Maybe she would say that. But my point is just that, historically speaking, that is a minority position. Secondly, I am not at all convinced that there are Christian parents who adopt gentle parenting and say, I don't believe in sin anymore, or I don't believe in atonement. Maybe they're out there. I don't know. What I have come across is people who say, look, I was raised in such a way that I heard hellfire and damnation from age 2 on, and it was terrifying. Or I was raised such that my parents were always assigning sin motivations to everything I did, even when I was a little kid who just was like overwhelmed, such that I developed religious OCD and scrupulosity where I'm overanalyzing everything is sin. Is God mad at me? Or people who say, look, I am not sure what I think about the atonement, but I don't want to take my 4-year-old to Easter Sunday and have them been told how painful crucifixion was and how the fact that they told a lie is what sent Jesus to this horrible, gruesome death on a cross. So they're maybe more saying like, I am not at all okay with a lack of age appropriate consideration for the catechesis of my children. So I don't know if that's a straw man or not. I have not come across many people who are still claiming to be Christian parents who say, I don't believe sin is something to consider for my children, or I don't believe it's my children have capacity for anger or lying or have capacity to sin. They are noticing, same way we did in these Christian parenting manuals, that oftentimes very young children are assigned adult kind of sin motivations with no grounds for it, with no consideration of child development, with no consideration of spiritual formation, even. And they're saying, we think that's a problem. So how that ties into gentle parenting, I don't know. Again, I think really at the heart of this is a kind of like reassurance of doing it right, a concern for theological stakes, and a presentation of that to a group that kind of already is on board with it. Um, I would love it for Christian parents if that kind of true invitation to critical thinking and curiosity could hold, and that we could trust in the grace of God to say, yes, you can learn about the other atonement theories and not feel panicked that you have left your child unmoored from the gospel, that you can love them according to the one anothering passages of the New Testament and the example of Jesus, and focus on that without panicking about cognitive, doctrinal catechesis. Because I really think that raises some uncomfortable questions. If everything about presenting the gospel hangs on our explicit cognitive understanding, what do we do with people who are cognitively impaired? Or what do we do with children who have maybe immature cognitive development? Maybe they're on a trajectory toward maturity that isn't prepared to understand sin in the robust theological way that makes sense of the many layers of the gospel, the multiple theories of atonement that even don't get at the fullness of this mystery. What does that do with the simplicity of Jesus's message that simply says, let the children come to me, and then he takes them in his arms directly and blesses them? So it's not to say those conversations aren't important, or that it certainly makes sense that parents who hold to that belief would really hold to it strongly and want to pass that on. I think it really becomes problematic when it insists one's own experience and theological framework is not only normative for everyone, but is conclusive for everyone, and then kind of sounds an alarm accordingly that really begins to demarcate an insider outsider status. Personally speaking, I find that uh, that sort of rigorous definition of frameworks to be unsatisfying, simply because I think we all are little heretics to some degree. And so the way we splice this down, I think, sometimes has an unfortunate effect of reducing the mysteries of the Christian faith to terms that we, in our rush to impart them like at a 3-year-old level, for instance, or at a 4-year-old level or a 5-year-old level, we've reduced them in ways that make sense to our theological frameworks, but by necessity in these very concrete and often limiting ways that, my gosh, you guys, it cut me off, and I hope I didn't lose everything. Otherwise, we might not get the rambling video because I don't think I'm going to do it again. But I'm not sure where I was at. I think, talking about the little box. And I do have a series, I think it's called like Spiritual Formation of Children, kind of talking about this more in depth. I do think when we do that out of our understandable desire to catechize children early, um, if we only hand them this box, then sometimes as they grow and mature, the box kind of bursts and they are left picking up pieces and either feeling like it's all a fairy tale, made up, childlike thing, or in this kind of really disorienting process of deconstruction. That I think is a natural part of faith formation. Again, Mid-Faith Crisis by Catherine McNeil and Jason Haig. If that's how you say his name, I can't remember. We did an interview with them on In the Church Library as well, if you're interested in that. But really gets at that. So anyway, all that to say, I don't think this is actually about gentle parenting. I think this is about preservation of one's own theological framework. Um, and concern that others would hold to that same theological framework, which is understandable, but maybe clarity of terms are super helpful. I don't know, because on where I'm sitting with all the work we have done for this, a lot of times people pick up a parenting book or resource. They have this question when they're in the thick of parenting a difficult season, right? Again, my guess is the primary person interested in this question in this audience is a mother of relatively young children. I'm going to guess 0 to age 8 or 9. That is the primary audience asking, is gentle parenting biblical? In a way that impacts them personally. I think you have people older on asking that question again to say, well, I used more authoritarian methods, so I really hope gentle parenting isn't biblical because I don't want to have to re-examine my methods, right? There can be just a fragility and defensiveness. And I'm not trying to speak for everyone's motives. I just think this is a piece of what plays into this conversation and why it continues to get resonance, even if what really is at stake isn't should you co-regulate your emotions with your child, or should you choose methods other than spanking. I do think spanking is the one thing that bridges this. That's the one thing that'll show up again and again. And sometimes people, it's just code for that. They mean by, are you a gentle parent? I don't mean like Abby, I don't know her position on this. I think before she's just declined to answer whether she spanks or not. But I think a lot of times people mean like, are you a gentle parent? In other words, do you not spank? And if you're not a gentle parent, it means you do spank. But otherwise, I think, yeah, what it's really about is the underlying theology and worthwhile conversation to have. Perhaps one where there's many, many different layers. And one, I believe, really we should maintain our own agency. If anyone listening still is finds themselves interested in exploring different theories of atonement, I have a couple reels with some good book recommendations for that. I think there's freedom to do that, and want to empower you to do that. There is a long, rich history of theology in the church of people wrestling with these questions, coming to different answers, many of them influenced by the history and thought of their day, understandably, as we are. Worthwhile questions. Okay, that is it for me for tonight. Happy Friday night. If you haven't yet, pre-order our book. We have some pre-order bonuses coming, I think, next week. We also are sending out an email subscription newsletter with a fun little downloadable. So if you haven't subscribed to our email newsletter, you can go to my website and subscribe there. And then look on in the church library for the conversation with Andrew in a couple weeks, if that interests you. I don't really know how to close this up except to say thanks for joining me for Friday night chat. And you can leave comments below if you'd like, or not. And happy weekend.